Pete Walker's book. Psychoeducation in CPTSD and trauma is really, really important, because just doing one modality, like for instance, if we do, you know, like I have therapy that I'm doing that's been going on for a year and a half. It's going on for a year and a half, but I'm halfway through it. And there are other modalities that I use as well, like I've used faster EFT to get rid of certain memories and stuff like that. But as I move through life, the more that I've looked at CPTSD and read up on it, and other books that I've come across as well, which I'll give you an example, which is a bit more complex. I've got one here that's called Trauma and the Soul. So we've all got souls, and if we've been traumatized in childhood, then we basically have what's called arrested development, which is really tough for a lot of people who've had trauma. So as a result of that, oh, sorry, I'm giving feedback there. So basically, as a result of that, what we have is that we have to dig in a bit deeper ourselves so that we begin to heal this stuff. So the purpose of my videos are to help people understand CPTSD and how it affects them. And if anybody's out there watching, I have a ladies group on Facebook, which you can go over to for ladies. For the guys out there watching, I've got information on groups that you can join if you have anxiety or CPTSD, which you can leave a message in the link below and ask me. And there is information below this video on how to deal, 13 steps to deal with flashbacks, and 14 ways of getting rid of the inner critic, because the inner critic is often what will stop us healing, because it's telling us that we're not allowed to feel anger or healthy blame towards our childhood abuse. We're supposed to be over it. Society has got a very strange way of looking at child abuse that goes on, in that a lot of people who've not been through it think people need to forgive parents, get on with it, get over it, and they don't realize the damage and how the depth of the soul is touched or shattered by early trauma, and that we also then have arrested development. So I'm going to start reading chapter 6, and it's what is my trauma type? So this is going to help people understand what their trauma type is. He says here, this chapter describes a trauma typology for recognizing and recovering from the different types of CPTSD. We human beings respond with some variability to childhood trauma. The model elaborates 4 basic survival strategies and defense styles that develop out of the instinctive fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses. Variances in your childhood abuse, neglect patterns, birth order, and genetics result in you gravitating toward a specific 4F survival strategy. So the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, you've got the healthy side to the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, which is if you're frightened, you're going to, basically run, you're going to flight. But if you're attacked, you're going to fight. So there is normal fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And then there's the fight, flight, freeze response that's occurred through child abuse or having, been abused as a child. And then we end up using 1 or 2 of those types that actually cause a lot of problems to us as adults. So I'm going to continue reading. He says here, you do this as a child to prevent escape and to protect yourself from traumatization. Fight types develop a narcissistic-like defense. Flight types develop an obsessive-compulsive-like defense. Freeze types develop a dissociative type defense. Fawn types develop a codependent-like defense. So the codependent type defense that is used means that we might be extra nice to people, just to keep in a relationship, as an example, that's really unhealthy for us, that we haven't got the ability to stand up for ourselves. So there's a lot of learning to get to with understanding CPTSD. But the more we understand, the more we will evolve the original trauma, and the more we're going to heal in ourselves. So going on, the next page of chapter 6 of Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, he says, healthy employment of the 4 Fs. So that 4 Fs are fight, flight, freeze, fawn. He says people who experience good enough parenting in childhood arrive in adulthood with a healthy and flexible response repertoire to danger. In the face of real danger, they have the appropriate access to all of their 4 Fs, F choices. Easy access to the fight response ensures good boundaries, healthy assertiveness, and aggressive self-protection if necessary. Untraumatized people are also easily and appropriately access their flight instinct and disengage and retreat when confrontation would exacerbate their danger. So we all know, when we have this healthy side to us where we know, we're in danger and we know not to respond or walk away, as an example. He says untraumatized people also freeze appropriately and give up and quit struggling when further activity or resistance is futile or counterproductive. Additionally, the freeze response is sometimes our first response to danger. So, for instance, if you saw a huge spider or a snake, in your vicinity, like really close by to you, the general thing that people will do will be go into freeze. If you've been through childhood trauma, and you were put in that position long enough that it made you freeze, that you were so frightened that you were freezing, as an adult, you will live your life like that, like on a daily basis, and it becomes inappropriate, and it means that we can't, that we end up abandoning ourselves and we don't develop our personality fully. Going on, he says, additionally, the freeze response is sometimes our first response to danger, as when we become still, quiet, and camouflaged to buy time, to assess the danger and decide whether fight, flight, continued freeze, or fawn is our best option. And finally, untraumatized people also fawn in a non-groveling manner and are able to listen, help, and compromise as readily as they assert and express themselves and their needs, rights, and points of view. A deeper elaboration of the origins of the 4 defenses is found below and in the next chapter. So on this page, he does have a little graph here, but I'm not able to read that through to you, so I'm just going to continue reading. And the book the link to this book is below this video. So what you can do, I think it's free on Amazon USA Audible, and it's free on Kindle UK. So you can get a free copy of this book, or you can buy a hard copy. I've got both. I've got the hard copy of this book. I don't have Kindle, but I've also got it on Audible. So I've heard this book and read this book many times, and the more I read it, the more sense it makes. So now he's explaining CPTSD, complex PTSD, as an attachment disorder. He says excessive reliance on fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response is the traumatized child's unconscious attempt to cope with constant danger. It is also a strategy to strengthen the illusion that her parents really care about her or him. In adult life, all 4 Fs are commonly ambivalent about real intimacy. This is because closeness often triggers us into painful emotional flashbacks. It reminds us of how we had to survive without comforting connection in childhood. Our 4 F defenses therefore offer protection against further re-abandonment by precluding the type of vulnerable relating that leads to deeper bonding. So it means that a lot of people that have been through childhood trauma, will overcompensate in their behavior and, will not tend to trust or form bonds that are, where they feel safe, or they just are not able to. And then also the other side to that is that some people will form attachments to people which involve codependency. And no matter how badly somebody treats you, you will continue with that relationship. And then what we say in society that goes around a lot is that we say, oh, I've got a boyfriend, he's a narcissist, or I've got this relationship where somebody's a narcissist. What's really going on is that clearly there are narcissistic people in this world, but what's really going on is that our choices have been, because the soul has been shattered as a child, we're not seeing things clearly. We're seeing things from a defensive point of view, and we're in protection mode throughout our adult lives. So the only way I've got to understand this is through psychoeducation. He goes on to say, a survivor also avoids vulnerable relating because his past makes him believe that he will be attacked or abandoned as he was in his childhood. This is why showing vulnerability often triggers painful emotional flashbacks. So you might relate to that. I certainly relate to that myself, that when I first started becoming vulnerable with people, I would get very scared that I was going to be abandoned, or that I was stupid, or there was something wrong with me, or I didn't have the right to cry or be upset in a situation, and I would apologize for my own feelings. And that's because your feelings as a child were not taken seriously or into account or valued. So as an adult, you know, there is arrested development, which means that we don't really know how to behave in ways that are beneficial for ourselves. And it doesn't mean there's something wrong with us. It just means that we need to unlearn a lot of the stuff that was implanted to us and conditioned into us in our early years. Children are sponges. Everything that's said, you know, even how to cross the road, we learn that from an adult. And all of those things, you know, and the behavior of parents that maybe gave a lot of cruelty or disdain, you know, that stays with us, and we have to work that out and get it out of our system. And the way we do that is through verbal ventilation, healthy anger, healthy blame, and grieving, and getting rid of the inner critic, so that the inner critic doesn't shame us when we begin to get angry about the way we were treated as a child. And in spirituality and religions, we're told that we have to forgive our parents no matter what they've done to us, or adults, because clearly not all abuse happens at the hands of parents. Some of it is, for instance, like the Catholic Church of late, and various other things that go on in the world. Continuing reading, he says, many fight types would avoid real intimacy by alienating others with their angry and controlling demands for unconditional love. This unrealistic demand to have their unmet childhood needs met destroys the possibility of intimacy. Moreover, some fight types delude themselves into believing that they are perfect. And that's narcissism. So, you know, there are some people that believe they're perfect and they're king of the castle or whatever, and they can behave in such ways that, you know, they can't form relationships, normal relationships. So I'll read that bit again. Moreover, some fight types delude themselves into believing that they are perfect. They see the other as the one who needs to be perfected. And this defensive belief then entitles them to totally blame their partners for relationship problems. Many flight types, so you might need to listen carefully here. So that was the fight type: fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. So now I'm on to the flight type. Many flight types stay perpetually busy and industrious to avoid being triggered by deeper thinking or relating. Others also work obsessively to perfect themselves, hoping to someday become worthy of love. Such flight types have great difficulty showing anything but their perfect persona. So I've lived that most of my life. I've either been in flight, which is like I've got to be perfect and that nobody's going to love me, or I've gone into freeze and I won't want anybody to be near me. And we do this throughout life, you know, with different people. We play out the different parts of the flight, freeze, fawn response. So going on, he says, many freeze types hide away in their rooms and reveries, fully convinced that the world of relating holds nothing for them. And I did that for about 10 years. I really believe the world holds nothing for me. Freeze types who have not been totally turned off relationships by horrible childhood neglect or abuse gravitate to online relationships. That's probably most people on Facebook then. A lot of people have CPTSD because, you know, there is a lot of trauma out there, but some people, because they don't think their trauma was that bad, they don't realize that they have CPTSD. And it's not a disorder, it's a response to events carried out over years of abuse, you know, be it subtle or quite physical, sexual or emotional through childhood. Going on, he says, those who are repetitively traumatized in childhood often learn to survive by overusing one or two of the 4F responses. So the 4 Fs, fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. Then he says, fixation in any 4F response not only limits our ability to access all the others, but also severely impairs our ability to relax into an undefended state. Additionally, it strands us in the narrow, impoverished experiences of life. Over time, a habitual 4F defense also serves to distract us from the nagging voice of the critic and the painful feelings that underlie it. Preoccupation with the 4F behaviors dulls our awareness of our unresolved past trauma and the pain of our current alienation. He's got a chart, another chart below in this book, but again, I urge you to get this book if you want to heal this stuff. So he says, this chart compares the harmful behaviors of each defensive structure. Real or imagined danger typically triggers us into these roles and behaviors when we are in an emotional flashback. So I might try and read this chart to you, and the link's going to be below for the book anyway, but he gives an example that fight is narcissistic, explosive, controlling, enslaving, entitlement, bully, autocrat, demands perfectionism, sociopath, and conduct disorder. And then the flight type. So this doesn't mean we're bad people. This is just education, because there is the normal, healthy fight, flight, freeze form response. And then there's the unhealthy fight, flight, freeze form response. So then he goes on to the flight. It's obsessive compulsive, panicky, rushing or worrying, outrunning pain, drivenness, adrenaline junkie, busyholic, micromanager, compelled by perfectionism. And he says mood disorder and possibly ADHD. Then the freeze response is disassociative, contracting, hiding and camouflaging, isolation, couch potato, space case, hermit, achievement phobic, schizophrenic and ADD. So don't take this literally if you think you've got CPTSD. He's just describing what the fight, flight, freeze form response here. And now I'm reading the fawn. Codependent, servitude, groveling, loss of self, people pleaser, doormat, slave, social perfectionism, victim, and parentified child. So the reality is we're not one. We have a mixture of all of those within us. And the good thing is that the more we read and understand, and me even talking about this here, it's putting information out there that is out there, but it's not widely available to the public. A lot of people who've got CPTSD and have had trauma don't realize it until later in their life just how badly it's affected them. I know a lot of 50-year-olds who have breakdowns. They get to a point of meltdown because they've gone through all of their lives. They've had childhood trauma maybe for the first 15 years, get to move on with life, go through life as a young adult, working, making ends meet to live in the world, maybe partying or doing whatever they do, maybe have a family or whatever. And then they get to a point where they realize they're not happy with their lives. They're not happy with their financial situations, their bodies or whatever, and there's meltdown. So this happens. I know a lot of people who've hit 50 or their late 40s who, just feel they can't cope anymore. And there are many ways to deal with this. But the first thing is that we have to grieve the original traumas and really see that where we've been hurt and look at it deeply in order to begin to evolve, the pain. So I hit my bottom in 2016, not my bottom, but hit rock bottom in 2016. And there were many losses in my life. And then bit by bit, I began to climb back into my real personality. I'm more real now than I've ever been. And I got rid of my toxic shame. I got rid of my guilt. And I began to speak out and help people also. So I'm going to continue reading. He says, many fawn types avoid emotional investment and potential disappointment by barely showing themselves. They hide behind their helpful personas and over-listen, over-elect, and or overdo for the other. By over-focusing on their partners, they do not have to risk real self-exposure and the possibility of deeper, level rejection. This chart compares and contrasts the differences between the 4 types. This might be a bit deep for people as I go through this, but the book will make it more clear. And I jumped a page, so I'm going to go back to this. He says, flight types learn to respond to their feelings of abandonment with anger. So fight, if you're a fight type, you're going to, you get, when you're abandoned, you get angry. Many use contempt, a poisonous blend of narcissistic rage and disgust, to intimidate and shame others into mirroring them. Narcissists treat others as if they are extensions of themselves. The entitled fight type commonly uses others as an audience for his incessant monologuing. He may treat a captured freeze or fawn type as a slave. This is a bit heavy language, but it's really useful. Somebody's just written there, they said, my mother is 81 and she has not faced her childhood and adult traumas, and she's never been to therapy, and now she's kind of crazy. But yes, that happens. I think there's 148 I'm speaking to there. Yes, that's what happens. So it's really imperative for those of us that are younger that see this going on. A lot of that, I'm not being rude about that generation, but I'm aware of this in astrology. There's generations of people, and a lot of people were really told to shut down and get on with it and not feel their feelings. And particularly in Britain, it would be the stiff upper lip. I don't know what you'd call it in America, but if you're in America, but because the audience here will be mixed. But I do think that, for us that are 50, that, we can help a lot of people now. People in their 50s and late 40s can help the younger generations by understanding this stuff and passing it on. And it's, there's a lot of denial in society about sexual abuse and child abuse. And, it's really coming to the fore now how bad it is. We had the, I think Harvey Weinstein, the Hollywood thing a few years ago. Then we had the Catholic Church. Then we've had the Michael Jackson case. And, I'm not commenting about those cases, but the reality is that people's eyes are being opened, and it's, sexual abuse is not acceptable in society, and clearly it runs deep, and there are many reasons why that is. But the more people that talk about it and aren't shushed or shut up into toxic shame and told to get on with it, the more it's going to help the younger children coming through today. Because clearly, there's going to be, whilst I'm an adult and I've been through child abuse and I've got over it, or sexual abuse, not got over it, but I've been able to excel at some level in my being. At the same time, I'm at a point where I believe, my healing is always going to be ongoing, because you never know when you're going to be triggered. So, but the more I know, the easier it gets to deal with my own flashbacks and nightmares and stuff like that. So life is getting better. So 148 says, she's my mum and I feel for her, and I wish she had the chance to find therapy. Instead, she and my father stayed in a very abusive relationship, and they verbally and emotionally abused each other. Yes, so people do that, and that's codependent. And often people who see that as children think it's normal. And I've had my fair share of, unpleasant relationships based on not knowing any better. But we grow through all of these things. So, we can't wipe out our own experiences of how valuable they are. But there comes a point that we realize, particularly I'm 50, I realize that life is short, and that we need to clean up our own backyard, like our own psyche. And it takes time to do that, and it takes knowledge. So I'm going to continue reading this. He says, the entitled fight type commonly uses others as an audience for his incessant monologuing. He may treat a captured freeze or fawn type as a slave or dominant submission relationship. The price of admission to a relationship with an extreme narcissist is self-annihilation. One of my clients quipped, narcissists don't have relationships, they take prisoners. And that's the truth of narcissists. It will be all about them. And we really have to look at ourselves in order to stop recreating the same problems in relationships. We can't fix other people. If somebody is narcissistic, they're generally that way with everybody. So as we work on ourselves, we feel differently about ourselves, and then we stop attracting, like the unpleasant ones out there. And I'm sad to say that, but it's part of life. You know, not everybody is decent, and not everybody's working on themselves, but we've all have the possibility to evolve, that's for sure. But it takes us individually making a choice that we're ready to, you know, do the work that we need to do. So then I've got the next bit I'm going to read. It's the charming bully. And he says, especially developed fight types can become sociopathic. Sociopathy can range along a continuum that stretches from corrupt politician to a vicious criminal. A particularly nasty sociopath, who I call the charming bully, probably falls somewhere around the middle of this continuum. The charming bully behaves in a friendly manner some of the time. He can even occasionally listen and be helpful in small amounts, but he still uses his contempt to overpower and control others. This type typically relies on scapegoats for the dumping of his vitriol. These unfortunate scapegoats are typically weaker than him. They may be members of a disenfranchised group. Excuse me there. The ethnic employees, the gays, women, his problem child or wife, etc. He generally spares his favourites from their behaviour unless they get out of line. So with narcissism, people will have their favourites, but the minute you stand up to them, then they're going to go for you. So, you know, many of us can see that we might have got involved with somebody and they've seemed very decent, and then we found out that they're not really who they say they are. So again, as we do the inner work, we're not going to be attracting such people. And if we do, then we're basically in a stronger position to know our own self-worth and self-value and not continue something that's really harmful to us. Continuing reading. If the charming bully is charismatic enough, those close to him will often fail to register the meanness of his scapegoating. The bully's favourite often slip into denial, relieved that they are not the target. Especially charismatic bullies may even be admired and seen as great. So where do we see this in the world currently? I don't know. I'm not going to suggest anything, but charismatic bullies, you know, that get away with it and scapegoat other people. You know, we can look in that in politics and all over the world, on television and such like, even on social media. Being the scapegoat child or spouse, and then he goes, online relating, gosh, I'm doing well with my pages here. Let's see, of bully, it's especially problematic because it is so difficult to get anyone to validate that you were or are being abused by them. I remember how perplexed I used to be at the photos of Hitler's ostentatious acting kindly to his children. So he's talking here about Hitler, how loving he was to his children. And I think as I write this, of how many billionaires are venerated and how many, and most of them stand up very poorly to closer scrutiny. So many billionaires use sociopathic tactics to accrue their fortunes. Examples of this are hostile takeovers, exploitive labor policies, health-destroying work conditions, devastating environmental practices, and various other forms of cheating, lying, and backstabbing. The great icon Henry Ford would regularly place new young workers at the front of his innovation assembly lines, the tired, used-up workers further down the line who could not then keep up with their were ushered out the back door. Labour unions eventually curtailed that practice in this country, but many jobs have since been exported to unregulated third world countries where workers labour in the same atrocious soul and body destroying conditions. So that happens quite interestingly, you know, with phone lines, like, you know, when we phone up, you know, to speak to, you know, people in the UK, it's shipped through to a different country where, you know, people are working for a lot less money and stuff like that. So there's some very underhand stuff that goes on in this world that most of us aren't aware of. He then goes on to say, and then on a much less grand level, I remember a best friend I had in my 20s. I thought he was a great guy for almost 2 years until one day, shopping in the supermarket with him, I witnessed him demeaning, lambasting of an innocent checker just out of sheer spite. So, you know, we might see people as being really beautiful and kind or whatever, but then we'll see a side to them that's really quite shocking. So we have to keep our eyes open and take note. I can see what you said there, One Thought. You said your father died. Okay, so I'll read that. And he was abused as a child by his father. Yes, and the thing is, we're at the, I've read what you said. So the point is that our generation needs to get to a point where we're not passing the buck and we're not saying, well, you know, so I could say I was abused, sexually abused or whatever, I was abused, and that because I was abused, you know, that's the reason that I'm abusive. So this is what, you know, really the work has to be deep, and that we don't pass the buck anymore, and that the children coming through now come into a world as best that we can, where they're not, you know, where it's not normal and it's not okay and it is unacceptable and there's no excuses, or if you get what I'm saying, if you're still watching. So let's see what he says next. So he says other types of narcissists. He says rageaholic narcissists are infamous for using other people as dumping grounds for their anger. They are addicted to the emotional release of cathartic in this way. The relief often does not last long before they are looking for another fix of venting their spleen. Okay. He says this type of narcissism is pure bullying. And bullying alone can cause PTSD. So if you're bullied or you've been bullied, then, you know, it's likelihood over a long period of time you're going to have PTSD or complex PTSD, and particularly from childhood events. If it goes on long enough, and it does with bullying parents in a dysfunctional family, it can cause CPTSD. If this rings a bell with you, please check out, he's got a webpage here. He says www.nobully.com. So I'll put that link below this video later this evening from my end, so that anybody can look at that webpage. He says, furthermore, and closer to a key theme of this book, I report the evidence of more than a few clients who were horribly abused by their pillar of the community, narcissistic parents. Among them is my suave, silent type father who regularly raged at and backhanded me and my sisters. He was much admired in our neighborhood. A final example of narcissism is the charming narcissist who is not necessarily a bully. I call this type the narcissist in codependent clothing. My friend's father is this type of charming narcissist. When you meet him, he lures you in with questions and elictation that make you feel like he is interested in you. But within a few minutes, once you have taken the bait, he suddenly shifts into monologuing like a filibusterer, he says. I don't know what that is. Then he says, this particular type often masters the run-on sentence, and there is a pause or interject or even offer an excuse for escaping. You have become a captive audience and your release will not be procured easily. I hope that made sense there. It didn't make much sense to me, that bit. So then he goes on to the recovery of these responses. So I think what I'm going to do, how far am I in? I think I'm going to read a little bit more. Okay. Recovering from a polarized fight response. I agree with the wildly held notion that extreme narcissists and sociopaths are untreatable. Typically, they are convinced that they are themselves are perfect and that everyone else is the problem. Fight types who are not true narcissists, however, benefit from understanding the costly price they pay for controlling others with intimidation, criticism, and sarcasm. Some who I have worked with eventually saw how their aggressive behavior scared away their potential intimates. One survivor also realized that although her partner stayed, he was so afraid and resentful of her demandingness and irritability that he could not manifest the warmth or real liking that she so desperately desired. So what goes on is that behavior is learnt in childhood, and then as an adult, we're acting out those defense systems, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And as we act them out, we're not doing it on purpose. It's because we don't know any better, and we have to learn to undo what has taken place. And that will happen through grieving, healthy anger, healthy blame, verbal ventilation, therapy. You know, tapping is a good one to get rid of panic attacks and anxiety, triggers. The more psychoeducation we have, the easier it's going to be to heal this stuff. So I think I'm going to leave it there for today, and I will continue the rest of these pages tomorrow. And then the following day, I'll get on with something else from the book and, you know, have a bit more live chat on that. So I really thank you for watching, and I hope whatever I've read today from chapter 6 of, let me show you the book again, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, Pete Walker. It's read well. You can see these are the pages from the book. So I'm going to have to get this one bound because I've really been through this with a fine-tooth comb. So I suggest get the book, see the links below, and see if you basically are acting out, not on purpose, but you go into triggers, you get triggered, and you go into the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. Please read the 13 steps for managing flashbacks below, and you can print off a copy so you can begin to work on your own early trauma and begin to get help. And I've got a ladies group over on Facebook. So just come over there if you're a lady and you want to join. And I do that for the privacy of women on female matters. And then there are groups I know for guys also that you might be interested in. Thanks for watching. Back tomorrow.